I bought a piece of calligraphy tonight. I don't know if it'll stand up. And if there's time, I'll tell a story about it. First disclaimer, I did not do that. That's not my calligraphy. But it was given to me. So if I get to it tonight, I'll tell you the story about it. We're picking up again on page 66. In the Lively Encounters chapter. So last week we had the week before. The week before, when everything was different, when we did Bhikshu Wu Jinsang. And now we're going to do the second Lively Encounter with Bhikshu Fahai. Bhikshu, of course, is the Chinese expression for a male monastic. And we'll just read the text, go into it, and see where it takes us. The Bhikshu, bracket Buddhist monk, Fahai was from, I'm guessing this is Chujiang in Shao province. Is that pronunciation right? Isn't the Q is the Chu, right? Chujiang in Shao province. When he first called on the master, he asked, "Will you please instruct me on the line?" And here's the line: "The mind itself is Buddha." The master answered, "When your preceding thought is not formulated, this is mind itself. And when your following thought is not extinguished, this is Buddha. Setting up in appearances is mind, and being free from them is Buddha. If I were to explain it fully, I would never finish, even if I spoke until the end of time. Listen to my verse." And this is the verse that's given by Hui Neng to Fahai. "The mind itself is called wisdom. Buddha is just concentration. Consciousness is clear and pure when concentration and wisdom unite. To understand this teaching, you must work on your own nature. It's been here all along. Both should be cultivated together." At these words, Fahai had a deep awakening and he spoke a verse in praise. "The mind itself is Buddha. I'm embarrassed I didn't understand. Now I have the source of concentration and wisdom. I cultivate both together and cling to nothing." So these are, it's a very short lively encounter, but very rich. But I don't think it's mysterious necessarily or impenetrable. So let's see if we can go into it a little bit. Here we have a case in point where illustrates many things. One is that the Dharma is usually given, the teaching is usually given on request, and here's the request. Bhikshu Fahai at some particular time asked for clarification on a very common expression that's used in the teaching, mind itself is Buddha. This up here is another version of that. This is full, and then some people eat ji or zhi xin, jiu shi xin, or ji shi xin. Ji. Okay, so full ji shi xin. Buddha itself is mind. You can reverse it, mind is just Buddha. So you can use itself or you can use just, essentially, is Buddha. Buddha is just mind. So this is a very famous line. It's used throughout the tradition. And Bhikshu Fahai has been practicing probably for some time, and he's been contemplating this line, what's its meaning? And the master just answers in an interesting way. And that's the second point I want to bring up. First is that there is a request for a teaching. There is a request for clarification. And the master is then responding specifically to this individual at this time for the causes and conditions of the question he's asking. And we don't know what his particular situation is. We don't know how long he's been cultivating, how sincerely he's been cultivating, if he's sort of sophistical, just sort of interested in sophistry, or if he's really, really sincere. we'd have to be able to look at this and say all of that would be implied by the way the answer goes. But the answer is rather, it's straightforward, and it's, I won't say it's exactly formal, but it's not like beating around the bush. Well, it's kind of like, sort of like this, it's like, No, there's none of that. It's just really straight. So the way I would read this is, he's asking sincerely, and he's getting a very straight answer, and he's getting something that both explains, but also maybe is further contemplation for him. It's like if we hear this directly, I could see myself saying, so could you explain it a little more than what you just said here, because it's not so obvious to me what that means. But apparently, as we see in the end, it was obvious to Fahai. So this is the other point I wanted to pick out. This teaching taken out of context, not done appropriately, not given at the right time to the right person, even if the question's asked, could go clunk. It could have no effect whatsoever, and it wouldn't be really a teaching. I go back to this because a teaching is that which has the effect, the catalytic effect of liberating or causing understanding. Even if it's to rub you the wrong way, there's a very strong response to it. So this case, whatever is going on, this is very appropriate to Fahai, and we see at the end he has a great understanding as a result of hearing this. The other thing I want to point out, the third point maybe I want to make, is that he doesn't answer necessarily abstractly. For example, he doesn't go into a long discourse about the mind and consciousness and the sixth consciousness and the seventh consciousness and the eighth consciousness, nor does he go into this long description of the Buddha being the Tathagata, the well-gone one, so on and so forth, who has these 10 powers and these marks and characteristics and so forth. It's not a discourse at all in an abstract way. He actually goes right to what I would call a functional or functioning answer. He is explaining this in terms of activity, in terms of the workings of the mind rather than the abstraction of the mind. And he's talking about the Buddha not as some far away deity, if you want to use that word, or an accomplished historical figure from the past, but it's existentially here and now. So it's very interesting. He goes to the functioning aspect, the actually operative dimension of this, and he goes to taking these out of a then and someplace else and bringing it to the here and now. So he says, when your preceding thought is not formulated, this is mind itself. And when your following thought is not extinguished, this is Buddha. Now, there's many ways one can interpret this. I'm just giving one slant on it and don't think it's definitive or exhausted. But it seems to me what he's saying here is the mind unattached, clinging to nothing, is the Buddha mind. That mind is Buddha, Buddha is that mind. Whoever has a mind or a state of consciousness that's where, like his line of awakening, let the mind be unattached, clinging to nothing. It responds according to what's there. It doesn't seek in advance, and it doesn't look backwards. It's constantly in the here and now, unattached, responsive, alert, and so forth. And I think that's what preceding thought formulated is not like anticipating, thinking ahead, making plans and schemes. This isn't happening. Thought arises in response to the conditions that appear, and it's always appropriate and right on. And then when the following thought is not extinguished, it means nor do you repress thought or cut it off and not try to have it be arising or responding. So it's not the arising of thought itself or the activity of thought itself that's the problem. It's clinging and attaching, either by being too much in an expectation mode, a scheming mode, a anticipatory mode, or thinking that if I just stop thinking, preceding my next thought, if I just cut it off, then I'll be awakened. And he's saying, no, the first one is to be anxious and always looking ahead, and the last one is to fall into dull emptiness, not having your mind open and alert and aware. So this awareness here, he's giving it as a formula of activity. That's what's really cool. He doesn't simply say, oh, just have an unattached mind. He says, when the mind works, don't let it get too far ahead, looking ahead, anticipating, planning, having all these expectations, which usually never really come about. Nor do you think it's just not having thought, extinguishing the mind. So he says, and he's playing with it a little bit here. He's saying, he could have said, when your preceding thought is not formulated, this is Buddha. And when the following thought is not extinguished, this is mind itself. Because he's doing a non-dual thing. It doesn't matter which way. You can say Fo Jishu Shin or Shin Jishu Fo. It has the same import. And then he goes further where he sets, now we've seen this before. Anybody remember appearances, how that came up before? The Chinese for this, I get my tones right, I think is xian, right? Fourth tone. Xian means mark, characteristic, appearances, how things appear. Well, it's one of the, remember he said one of the basis of our school? The essential basis of our school, our teaching is, huh? Right, freedom from appearances. This is the Shan. What's the other two? Connie, where's Connie? What are the other two, Connie? Freedom from appearances. They're all woo, not. You're. Yeah, they're right in this text. He says the basis of our school is freedom from appearances, freedom from thought, wu nian, and wu zhu, freedom from attaching dwelling. And then he goes on to explain what this means. It's not a dull emptiness, nor is it an active seeking, but it's a balance so that in the midst of appearances, you're fully aware, but you're not moved by them. You're responsive to them, but you're not controlled by them. You're not thrown off center, if you will. So here he does the same thing. He says setting up an appearances is a mind. Setting up an appearances means that you do not pull yourself out of the flow of things. You don't pull yourself out of the world and withdraw. You are in the midst of the conditioned reality, and you're fully there. At the same time, you're free from them. Now, it seems to be, well, wait a minute, how can you set up and both be set up and free from them? And it's not as enigmatic, or it's not like some mystical koan. Basically, what he's saying is and other people use the expression, you're in the world but not of the world. You're fully present, engaged, but you're nowhere seeking and grasping, attaching, and then setting up an identity. It's sort of like the qualities that are sometimes put out of a really good teacher. Well, whether it's kindergarten or up to graduate school. A teacher is someone who's totally engaged in the minds and thoughts and the moods and expectations and even biases of the student, but at the same time is not judgmental and is acting in response to those. Teaching this here, teaching that there, with really no expectation of applause afterwards or fear that if I say this, it might rub them the wrong way. It's a kind of a totally engaged thing, but it's almost a therapeutic relationship. A doctor could be another example of someone who is in the midst of appearances but not moved by them. Sees them, sees what the cause is, goes to act, does the treatment that's necessary without blaming the patient for the accident, or saying I won't treat you because you're hopeless or something like this, and just moves on to the next patient. Doesn't say, well, I hope you come back sometime, and like, I don't need you to come back. I just need you to get well and move on. So we have some examples, just common examples like this of what it means to be in the midst of appearances, but not, as he says, but free from them, free from a sticky influence. Either you sticking to them or allowing them to stick to you. So it's this perfect example. He says, everywhere engaged, nowhere attached. That's the other expression he uses to describe this. Now, he says, if I were to explain it fully, I would never finish. What do you think he means by that? That's an interesting expression. Open hunting. Take a stab. Yes, Connie.
I'm thinking because
I'm not sure I caught what you said.
Like,
If they weren't,
because even if he did explain it fully once, maybe most of his disciples wouldn't be fully awakened yet. So he would have to continue explaining it fully.
that's okay. So that's an interesting take. In other words, if you don't get it the first round here, there's not much more I can say. And to speak more on this would be to keep hammering a nail that's crooked. It's not going to go on the board straight. So let's pause here. However, if your nail is straight and I hit you on the head, it's going to penetrate and go right through. So that's one way to interpret it. Yeah.
Whereas there are infinite number of appearances from the mind. The mind
Again, a little.
There are infinite number of appearances from the mind. The mind creates infinite number of appearances. If you point out each one of them and ask which is each one of them, then
Right. So what I'm basically giving you is I'm giving you the core theory. Now the implications and the applications of this are boundless and meaningless. Like say, what does that mean about food? What does it mean about clothes? I say like, okay. If you get this, well, like Confucius says, if I lift up one corner, a good student will pick up the other three. The converse is true. I pick up three, and the student's still thinking, well, what do I do with that? What's the fourth corner? So, in this case, it could be something like that. Yeah. So the implications are limitless and boundless. I can never exhaust them. That's one meaning. Or if you didn't get it the first time. And that may not be all, but clearly that's all he's going to say about it. But then he gives a verse. And again, verses are given, well, for a number of reasons. One reason, why give a verse? Because they really like to do poetry. This is like slam poetry, right? Little tea, a couple poems. Yeah.
This is sort of beyond words, and poetry can hit your mind at a level that's sort of below the rational, linear thought.
Yeah, that poetry is a language that pushes language past its limitations almost. It's language that points to an understanding that words itself, but arranged in a certain way, can trigger an insight. And I'm very fond of poetry, and I think a lot of the teachings are rendered in poems. As I say, my own teacher wrote very little, but mostly what he wrote was poetry. And so that's one thing, is that a poem can sort of chisel right into the heart. Anything else about a verse? Yeah, there's a mnemonic dimension. The mnemonic meaning is that you can remember it. And I find myself often using poetry in that way, especially poems like this, as little markers. As I move along, they just trigger something in me, and because they have a rhythm and a rhyme and get quintessentially down, they distill things down, they're very easy to hold in memory. And if you memorize them, they also, interestingly, have a way of coming up at an interesting time. So it's like you absorb them, but then a situation comes up, and that principle in that poetry just goes out and connects to that specific. And that's kind of a neat moment. So there's many reasons he's giving verses. Could be for memorization. It could be because this is very succinct. And he says, now he goes, the mind itself is called wisdom, and Buddha is just concentration. Now, we saw this earlier in another chapter where this was presented as first there's concentration, then there's wisdom, and he said, no, don't think about it that way. Wisdom and concentration are one and the same, like a light and a lamp. They're not two different things. Now here, concentration is referring to, if you want to, the misunderstandings his disciples had, that concentration was sitting in meditation. Concentration is pulling your senses from reality, withdrawing into a samadhi of non-attention. And then wisdom is a manifestation of deep understanding, which usually takes the form of action. It's seen in one's activities. But he's saying here, these are, again, one and the same. With true concentration, there is wisdom, and with wisdom, there's true concentration. This is the non-duality of movement and stillness. While moving, while active, you are still. There's a stillness, an equanimity. And yet in that equanimity and stillness, there's still this alert movement dynamic. So this is a principle of martial arts, but it's also a principle here that you find movement and stillness and movement. In concentration, you're still in the world, and while still in the world, you haven't left the basic concentration of not moving, not being turned by states, and so forth. Then consciousness, when these two unite, it's kind of reversed. When concentration unites, consciousness is clear and pure. So when these two are brought together, then your consciousness, your ordinary consciousness, was usually discursive and all over the place, now becomes clear and pure, and now becomes wisdom itself. And later, I think it's later, I don't remember when he has, at the point of turning, no, is that a later? So later he'll go into this and he'll give a description about how ordinary consciousness, the 5 consciousnesses, the 6 consciousness, which we call vijnana, the 7th and 8th consciousness, these are all just different manifestations of a similar consciousness. When they are not awakened, when they are not clear, they function in a discursive, confusing way. And they set up a whole constructed reality that we take for being something permanent real. When they're turned around in this description he's giving here, that very consciousness turns into the wisdoms, and he lists them as corresponding wisdoms of the consciousness transformed. So consciousness unawakened or dysfunctional, if we want to use that, is just ordinary and meandering and not clear. When it's concentrated and brought to the absence of attachment and grasping, it becomes wisdom that penetrates. And so the great wisdom, sometimes it's called great mere perfect wisdom, instead of consciousness going out and scattering, it has this wonderful reflective quality that can embrace and see everything very, very clearly. Sometimes they use the pond. When the pond is still, everything's reflected perfectly in the pond. When the pond's moving, you're just getting shards of things and you're not getting a true picture. Consciousness is compared to that. So ordinary consciousness is the movement of the pond chased by the wind and whatnot. When the water settles, in other words, when consciousness settles, then everything becomes reflected clearly as it is, and that's called wisdom. So he's doing that here. Now he says, to understand this teaching, this really, I think, to me, drives the point home. You must work on your own nature. Oh, I thought I'd go to the library after you said that and maybe check it out, or I'd Google search wisdom and no. You work on your own nature. It's like, wow, there it really comes back. In a sense, what he's profoundly saying here is there is no other place to apply effort except on your own nature. So you might say, mind is Buddha. Whose mind? Your mind. The Patriarch's going, your own mind, your own me? Moi? Yes, you, your own mind. Now, if it's not in that state right now, you should ask yourself, why not? How did I lose it? What happened to it? If this mind itself. So here, he's going right to not only the mind ground, but one's own mind ground, one's own nature. So this is like really the existential thrust. You must work on your own nature. Then, this line is really beautiful. The next one, it's been here all along. What's been here all along?
Your Buddha nature.
The Buddha nature, okay.
My mind.
My mind has been here all along. How did I lose it? Where did it go? Yes, Confucius says, as through its comings and goings, it has no time or tide, no place, and no one knows where it will abide. And surely it was the mind he was speaking. This is like, yeah, where did it go? Where did my Buddha mind go? You took it. You hit it on me, you know. It dove to the bottom of the pond and I can't tease it out again. So the texts are really clear by not paying attention to it, as the classic of purity and stillness says, when we don't watch over it, our desires entice it away. So it's been here all along. This could also refer to the Buddha nature as always whole and complete and never leaves for an instant. But we don't cultivate it, we don't awaken to it, and so we think it's not here, or we think it's someplace else, or we think it even further, it's in a Buddha someplace else, and not in my own nature. Both should be cultivated together, mind and Buddha, Buddha and mind. In fact, you cannot cultivate one without the other. If you hope to find and discover the Buddha, you can only find and discover the Buddha through the workings and the clarification of your own mind, not some other place. Boom. I mean, this is really, I suppose in the Chinese this is even more terse or succinct. than our English translation. And at these words, and here's the moment, Fahai has this deep awakening, and he speaks a verse in praise. Now, we had some thoughts about why the patriarch would speak a verse. Why is Fahai putting forth a verse here?
Isn't it usually the case that after you get awakened, you immediately kind of like think of the verse?
As soon as you get awakened, automatically a verse comes. Well, we're kind of laughing, but there's lots of stories where that seems to be the case.
I'm not so sure yet.
Yeah. And you don't want to be too quick writing your verse. But don't you remember earlier there was this contest between Shensho and Hui Neng on the verse, and so the verse was going back maybe to your point that you were making about the power of verse to take words and language and then point to something that's quite beyond them. And so in this case, if you're trying to talk about the mind ground or the awakened nature, language itself could not really encompass it, but it could suggest to it. So this could be the same way that the verse is expressing an understanding is somewhat ineffable. It's a little bit beyond words. And so it has that same meaning that he does here. Yeah.
I think it might be a testament to the power of the mind, too, because it's actually sort of hard to write poetry at a moment's notice. He's having a conversation and suddenly comes out with his verse, which sort of seems like some layers have been peeled back and allowed him to deliver this.
Yeah, and this is quite remarkable. If in 15 minutes as we close the class, I'm just going to go around and ask everybody to spontaneously produce a verse. And you say, well, your lecture didn't penetrate at all, so I'm not inspired. Okay, pass. But you're right. How do you come up with this on the spot?
I look at this as just him sort of being contrite and appreciative of just like, oh, I'm having an aha moment, and this is poetry, I guess, but it's more or less just sort of a statement coming out of him. It seems like just more of a just flowing out of his mind at the time. To me, it's not that big of a deal, a piece of poetry.
Well, or the
Translation.
other way you might look at it, if it is indeed the case, as the patriarch says here, and as we see in other texts, that all of the sutras, all of the teachings come from an unattached, unbound, liberated, awakened mind. If that's the case, then they flow forth like a bubbling spring naturally. There's nothing to impede them. In fact, it's saying this ineffable eloquence, if you will, is not something that's contrived or studied or learned, but is actually the opening of the mind's natural state of expressive wisdom that's happening here. And it comes out just that free and spontaneous. Because there's nothing more, no calculations, no misgivings, no doubts or apprehensions or second thoughts to curb it. I think there's something to that. I've seen this happen with my teacher and other people, and sometimes someone rises above themselves and can do this, and other times it's like, ugh, or they repeat one they heard before. So you memorize all the best special verses and then you pull it out and call it your own. But here he has his own, and he starts the verse with, first of all, the mind itself is Buddha. Now he's taken his question, and he says, mind itself is Buddha, question mark? Now the question mark is gone. He's saying mind itself is Buddha. So he's gone from uncertainty and doubt to clarity, and now he's making it as a declarative statement rather than interrogative or question. I'm embarrassed I didn't understand. What do you make of that? That's really a lovely. I'm embarrassed I didn't understand.
It's so obvious to him now.
Right, it's like so obvious to me now. It's like, geez, how could I have missed it? But then when he says, it's been here all along, that last line above from the Sixth Patriarch, it's sort of like, well, if it's been here all along, how come I didn't, so the embarrassment is kind of like, I was so covered over, I couldn't see it. And it's not like it's really obscure or profound. It's just so obvious that there's a little embarrassment there that he wasn't quite on all this time. Now I know the source of concentration is wisdom. What's the source then? Yeah. The source of concentration and wisdom is just this unattached mind. I cultivate them. I nurture them. I nourish them. I cherish them. I'm an artist, and I work on cultivating my mind both together. I cultivate in the world as if I'm not bound up in the world, and I cultivate my meditation as if I'm never apart from living beings in the world. This is that non-duality. I cultivate and cling to nothing. And cling to nothing. It's really a beautiful, the image that's sometimes used is sort of like the full moon. There was just a recent full moon. The full moon that is able to just move through empty space, clinging to nothing, and yet not stopping. And it's one of the images that's used to the cultivated person or the sage is able to move through all things in the world in the same way. Bright, complete, and yet not stopping anywhere, and not hitting anything or obstructed anything. And so they say, I'm sorry, Mars, will you move? I'm coming through. You know, it just sort of finds its way to move without attachment and obstruction. So this is Fahai. What I wanted to do a little bit tonight, leading into this, because I said I was going to, I took on an ambitious project. I was going to say, to some extent, talk about how I don't feel. What we call Buddhism or the Buddha Dharma, and I prefer Buddha Dharma, quite fits our standard categories of understanding or making sense of a discipline like this. And I used the examples of religion, philosophy, science, and I might add psychology as a component of this. And I was going to go into that, and maybe I bit off more than I can chew, but I'm going to try to, every other night or so when there's something that comes up that triggers that for me, I'll go into it a little bit. This passage tonight triggered for me how whatever this teaching is, whatever is being presented to him, is not really a religion. So he's getting a profound teaching, a direct teaching, but it's really hard in a conventional way to call that religious, because he's not giving a dogma or doctrine to accept on the basis of the authority of Hui Neng, or even on the tradition. He doesn't mention this is what we believe in our tradition, nor on faith alone, but rather he's given something that goes directly to his mind and nature, right in the human, and at the same time is what you might want to say is transcendent in terms of Buddha. So the Buddha, whatever Buddha is, being the highest personification of, you know, I won't say divine here, but the totally perfected, accomplished potential is right within this disciple's own mind and heart at that moment right then. So in that way, it really doesn't seem to fit the standard definition that this is a religious exchange here, but rather something else. At the same time, they're both monks. They're monastic clergy. They've ordained and taken vows. They daily, we know, perform rituals and devotions. They have their morning ceremonies, their lunch ceremonies, their evening ceremonies. They give and receive precepts and refuge. And we saw in the earlier chapter how he did a whole liturgy that, I mean, you couldn't call anything but religious. I mean, there's no way to, and yet, what I'm trying to get at is it does seem to have many of the markers that we would call religious, but underneath it, fundamentally, there's something else going on that isn't quite the same, and that's pointing back to a framing or pointing back to a source that is other than what we normally render as religion. So let me just say, this isn't my thought alone. There's been a number of people who have questioned over time how well or how awkwardly what we call Dharma or Buddha Dharma doesn't fit into any of these categories that we have, our categories of knowledge, our categories of understanding. I sort of think, well, you can say it's like, well, is it like a square peg in a round hole? Okay, so if you want to get the peg, it'll go into the hole. I can tell you when I was 5, I got square pegs in the round holes. I just hammered the hell out of them until they went in. And took out the edges of the square, but it got in there, and my mother was like, now we can't get it out, and you ruined the toy. Or my sister used to put round pegs in square holes, but they would wobble because they went, So we both had different approaches to this, but we were both determined once you heard that expression from my grandfather, you can't put a, around. Yeah, we can do it, and then we'll wobble and bling. So yeah, we did it, but they didn't quite fit, And so I'm sort of arguing a little bit along those lines. Yes, it kind of fits in the hole, but it doesn't. Okay, it's either crammed in or it's too loose. So let me go into this why. First of all, and this is a conventional rendering of religion. It's what I would, if I had asked most people, I would go to a Thanksgiving gathering, I'd say, what do you think religion is? Not to give a Durkheim definition of religion or something like this, or a Desjardins, just give a straight definition of religion. People say, usually it's associated with a divinity or God. But Buddha is not a God. Okay, so the highest personification of whatever that state is, the Buddha or a Buddha, is not a God. And there are gods in the teachings, they're called devas, and they're present and they're all over the place, but they're not really relevant to one's own liberation. Okay, so they're there, but they aren't the prime determiners. In fact, they're rather secondary and sometimes inconsequential. And in some ways they're rendered as a level of really wonderful existence, but still attached and still caught within the turning wheel. And then the state that he's talking about here, whether we call it Bodhi or Nirvana, is actually not a heaven. It's not a permanent remove of some transcendent place apart. And again, the heavens exist. Heavens are talked about in the text, but they're not placed as the highest position of accomplishment, nor as final resting places, and not even desired goals. These are not where you would set your sights if you really wanted to be accomplished and liberated. So, we have this problem. Buddha's not a god, Nirvana's not a heaven, and then you have, like say, Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, they don't save anyone. So they're not saviors or redeemers because, again, I quoted that famous passage from the Dhammapada, an early Buddhist text that says, the word is liberate or save, depending on how you want to translate it, but no one liberates or saves you but yourself. No one can, no one may. You yourself must walk the path, which is here. You must work on your own nature. You must work. Buddhas only show the way. And Bodhisattvas basically are guides, mentors, pointers. But they cannot take one across, so they don't actually do that job. So then, you have that. Let's see what else I was coming up with here. Oh, and then sometimes if I ask somebody, where is the basis of your faith and your religion, they'll say it's in the book. It's in the book. And by that, they're referring to a sacred text. And again, Buddhism has text. And people are very devout in how they study and pay attention to those. But according to the teachings themselves, according to the texts themselves, they are not to be regarded as dogmatic, rock-solid truth, but they're more a makeshift raft, a device you use to get you to cross over a dangerous river. And once you're crossed over, you're supposed to let go of it. Get rid of the raft or the book because it's served its purpose. In the same way, once the medicine has cured the illness, you stop taking the medicine. So again, there is a canon, if you wish, and you could call it a sacred canon, but it's more as an expedient device that's used to produce an effect that removes the necessity of the device itself. So this is really interesting. And moreover, in that way, the Buddhist canon is called an open versus a closed canon. And by open, it means it's evolving. And it's open to many voices and sources, not just one. For example, someone would say, well, I don't know, let's say God or apostle or, prophet so-and-so said it, okay? And that becomes the argument. No, he didn't. Yes, he did. No, he didn't. Yes, he did. Well, he said it right here, but he didn't mean that, blah, 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 blah. And the argument goes back and forth about who said what. But from the open canon point of view, from this teaching is like, well, is that right? I don't care who said it. Is it true? Does it work? Does it lead to liberation? And so the authority in the tradition is not to the canon per se because the Buddha said it, but let's say it this way. It's not true because the Buddha said it. The Buddha said it because it's true. So you work a reverse around. So then the Buddha said, in this canon, it doesn't have to be what I said. He specifically told his disciples, I'm just passing along something I discovered. And there's been many before me who have discovered identical things, and you yourselves may, and there may be teachings that come across that, in fact, are true and Dharma, and they won't be spoken by me. This text is a case in point. The Sixth Patriarch Sutra was not obviously spoken by Siddhartha Gautama Shakyamuni Buddha, because as far as we know, he wasn't in China during this time. He probably wasn't even know, in that sense, where China was. So that means that, let's say in Los Angeles next year, someone's sitting underneath the palm tree and reaches on Uttara Samyak Sambodhi and says, thus it is. And they begin, that could be a sutra. That could be part of the canon. It's open to, it's flexible, it's not closed. So that's another thing. And then even the element of faith, there is faith. Clearly there's faith. I mean, you can translate it as trust or confidence, but there is a ground of faith here in these teachings. For example, he wouldn't be coming to the Sixth Patriarch unless he had some faith in both that teacher and the possibilities of those teachings. Otherwise, why knock on the door? Right? He's not knocking on the door to be skeptical. He's knocking on the door because there's an underlying confidence or trust he has in this. So even though there's faith, it's not a final stance. It's not a goal to rest in faith. It's actually an instrumental device to get you to testing it and knowing for yourself. It's almost like an hypothesis. If you don't start out with some hypotheses, I'm going to say that this is tentatively true, and then you begin to experiment with it, you'll never actually test it out. So again, in this tradition, faith is called the source of the way. It's very interesting. It's called the source of the way. It's not called the end of the way. It's the beginning of that exploration. And in the three turnings of the Four Noble Truths, I mentioned this last week, I'll say it again, the last one is self-confirmation, knowing for yourself that this is true. You've actually tested it, and you know the flavor for yourself. So again, faith is a little different. So I would say there are those elements are there, but they're not quite framed the same way, and they don't carry the same meaning and aim at the same thing as most conventional things of religion. And finally, there is this non-duality, and to me that's one of the most important. The tradition I was earlier brought up in was that there was a transcendent being who was the creator of the earth. And there was a duality there. I was part of the creation. I could approach the creator. I could even, from a mystical point of view, have some kind of union or profound, intimate relationship with the creator, but I could never be the creator. And in this text that we just read tonight, he's saying, no, your mind, your nature itself is Buddha, and Buddha is your mind. There's not a duality here. So it's like, that's why we'd say, whoa, that's broken down now. And so your emphasis is not to supplicate or draw near to the Buddha, but to cultivate your own nature so that the Buddha of your own nature manifests. And later he says that's the only Buddha there is. So there's just a few points I was trying to make tonight where they're not exactly, you can't say it's not a religion, that'd be foolish, it has, but it's a religion in a different way. And those different ways are not insignificant. I think it's important to pay attention to because it's very easy to just cast Buddhism as another one of the world religions. Yeah, but there's all these little fine points you have to be careful. And the reason you want to be careful is because Hung Sure told a story a couple of weeks ago how he became a Buddhist for 15 years, but his mind still remained in a previous setting he had as a Christian. And so he was taking the motifs and psychology and values and expectations that are very subtle in that teaching and just transferring over. And so the master said, you still see the Buddha as a cop. I'm sure, he says, like someone who's going to scold you for your misdeeds or reward you for your da-da-da. And he says, you really haven't converted at all to Buddhism. So it's like we have to be careful as we're going through this process to make sure we're not superimposing a preset of what we think religion is on top of this, and then have our practices morph into seeking outside, thinking I'm not worthy, I don't have it, and so on and so forth. I'll give you an interesting story. This is to illustrate this point. And when I first went to Asia with my teacher, we were in Kuala Lumpur. Anybody know where Kuala Lumpur is? It's funny, when I was a kid in Wisconsin, somebody mentioned Kuala Lumpur, and I thought, oh, that is like Shangri-La. It just sounded so magical and mystical that I could go to Kuala Lumpur. You know, and I saw all these exotic animals and fruits dangling from trees and so forth. And I thought, oh, well, and then Kuala Lumpur is not quite like that, but it's, you know, we were in Kuala Lumpur, we got off the plane and we had to take a cab to this temple we were staying, and the cab driver picked us up, and here's two weird-looking guys, Hung Sure and myself, who are looking like Buddhist monks, but obviously we're Westerners. So there's something that, again, square hole peg, wobble doesn't fit. But then there's Master Hua, who's obviously Asian-looking, has a robes on, he just looks like that's a Buddhist monk. So he doesn't even talk to us. He says, he turns to the master, and he says, "Oh, Venerable," as he's driving, elbow, you know, on the, that's how they do in Kuala Lumpur. Well, also in Kuala Lumpur, they have one foot on the brake and one on the gas.
My mother drives like that.
Oh my God, I get so car sick. They don't, like, it's just back and forth, so you're constantly like this. And so he's doing that, and he says, "Master Hua, the Theravada tradition says there's only one Buddha, but the Mahayana tradition says there's many Buddhas. Which one is it?" And the master, without even blinking, like I'm thinking, gee, that's an interesting question. I was in the master without blinking just says, basically there's not even one Buddha. There's just great wisdom. And then we drive on the cab, he's going, that's interesting. You know? And so I was thinking about this in terms of this text. Again, even the Buddha presented one or many is brought down to there's just what he says here, this wisdom, this fusion. And when that manifests, just that is Buddha. And even a Buddha already is gone into setting up something too marked, Xiang. So now, what about this? Why did I bring this down? Because, first of all, it hangs on my wall where I meditate, and I saw the text, and I thought, oh, gee, they're similar. So, and I don't know who did this. I know who did it, but I don't know his name. And so here's the story, because I wanted to use in my personal illustration with this. When I was a young monk traveling in China, I went to a very famous monastery called Tiantong Si. I don't know, anybody heard of Tiantong Si? I'll do a little background on it here. It goes back to about 300 AD, so it's really old. And it means Si is monastery. Tiantong is like heavenly child, heavenly child. It's one of the most important Chan monasteries. It was built around 300 AD. It's second to the 5 sacred Chinese Zen Buddhist mountains. Very large complex of buildings, at time total 999 rooms. I don't know why 1,000. And it's shrunk to a mere 730 today, arranged in 20 groups of buildings, rising up the mountain slope. And it's a beautiful setting. It's one of the largest Chinese Buddhist temples. It's located in Zhejiang province, about 15 miles from Ningbo, and very near to the Ashoka Temple. Let's see. It truly is amidst, they say, thick clouds and numerous famous scenic spots. The hills behind the temple are covered with little caves and a wide variety of concrete wilderness pavilions and animals in a variety of shapes and styles. The temple itself contains numerous important imperial stelae, inscriptions, historic stone. In fact, I got one I brought back where they take these stone inscriptions and they charcoal over the top of it. So I got a really cool one I brought back with me. I didn't do that. They do it for you. And it's also a very important site for the Japanese Zen, Soto Zen, because this is where the famous monk Dogen studied and learned and got his Chan was at this place. So this goes really back a long time. And it's, many monks studied here with him in 2.5 years, and then the expression is, having dropped mind and body, they received the teaching from this great master and so forth. So this is a very impressive place. And I had the good fortune of going there to visit for, I was about a week. I really liked the Chan Hall. It was cool and very little lights, but then the door to the Chan Hall was like this double blanketed, like you see the Chinese monks or nuns where they wear these cotton clothing, the big clothing that are stuffed with cotton. Well, they had 2 big layers of that completely blocking the door, so when I came down, there was no slam, but it just insulated the room perfectly and kept out the wind and cold. And so when that went down, you didn't open that anymore. You had to wait outside until it opened again. And then you sit in meditation in this hall. But I was struck by the scenery, so I thought, I'm going to go to the Tiantung bamboo grove that I'd heard so much about. It is really cool. This bamboo grove, yellow, green, and most impressive, purple. The purple bamboo. And it's just like out of, what is it, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon? No, seriously, this is like a redwood forest in bamboo. Some of that purple bamboo was that thick. Right? I mean, it was really huge and tall, and when the wind blew, just the sound of it was and it was so clean and pure. And I thought, I'm going to sit here and get awakened. And all I got was a bunch of mosquito bites, because where the bamboo is, there's a lot of moisture, and so the mosquitoes were just feasting on me, and I didn't have enough samadhi to say, go ahead, suck my blood. I was like, they ran out of there. And so I kind of hung out there. I sat in the meditation hall and checked out all the different, and there's amazing stuff there. It wasn't destroyed in the Cultural Revolution. It was somehow protected. Although parts of it were damaged, the essential parts were probably protected. I'm guessing it may have been under the protection of Zhou Enlai, because he had at that time taken upon himself to save certain, and this was, in terms of a historic site, this is really impressive. But then, I wandered around getting to my story, and they have a wonderful woodworking shop where the monks make images, statuary. And I just got mesmerized by watching the monks work on this wood, chisel and carve and whatnot. And so here's the story. So I walked up to this sort of just plain monk who was just really working, and he looks at me and he has a nice smile on his face, and I don't know it wasn't Hung Sure, somebody else was translating for me, and my greedy mind got going. He says, can I have a Buddha image? Will you make me a Buddha image? And he smiles back at me and he says, why don't you make your own? And I said, and I was like taking this at face, and I said, well, I don't have any wood carving skills like you. I was going to sort of build him up so he would say, then I'll make you one. And then he got really gruff and he frowned, and he said, what does carving wood have to do with it? And he went back. And I thought, did I say something wrong? And so that was seemingly the end of it. And about 4 days later, it was time to leave, and I was kind of disappointed. And then this young novice monk comes running up, and he says, he called me by my name then, because that's what's here. He said, Han Chao, the old monk in the wood shop has these gifts for you. He wants you to take them with you. I said, And there was this. So this is Tiantung, so this is the place it is. That's my name for me. And then it's Fo Ji Shi Xin. It's like, so what does wood carving have to do with it? you carve it out of your own mind. But the most pleasant surprise was then he also handed me this. And the monk had carved this for me. So it was sort of like a kind of gruff instruction, but then at the end, I got both. So, but it has a different meaning for me now when I put them side by side. But I will leave both up here, so if you want to see. Actually, when I looked at this, it's amazingly exquisite. It's very small, and he was an old timer, you know, and he had lots of cuffs and rough on his. But when he carved this, when he finished it and did it, it's actually got some wonderful subtle qualities to it. So I brought it back. What does wood carving have to do with it? So I'll leave this up here if you care to look at it. We'll close tonight, and next, when we get to some passages that I think maybe apply to philosophy or science and psychology, I'll do my little stuff on that too to kind of. And I'm not trying to. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that these are inadequate or worse tools of inquiry, but I just want to point out that they don't necessarily match up head to head with what we call Dharma, and it's really important to understand what those differences are, lest we change it into something it's not and we feel we got a handle on it, when in fact it probably should have a handle on us. So I'll leave it at that. Is there any announcements? Yes.
Next week, right?
Oh, yes, there's a class next week. Why would you ask? It's Black Friday.
That's your favorite day.
Right, so here's two ways of looking at it. This class will be a black, dark, gloomy class on Friday. Or if you get nauseated from shopping too much, you can come in here, recover Friday night. Or if you ate too much the day before. Or if, as lovely and as charming as your family is, more than 2 hours with them is too much. You know, you have an excuse to say, I'd love to stay tonight and talk about my relationships and my future, but I have to go to the lecture. And then you can zip out and come to the lecture on Friday. So traditionally, we haven't taken Friday off, and we thought to do it, but most people say it's kind of nice to have it on Friday. So we will have a Friday night class next week. Okay? Now,
also, tomorrow we have 7:30 p.m. Jin Fosher will give the lecture Limitless Light Sutra. And all activities, like always, goes, all classes. And for more information, please visit our website, berkeleymonastery.org.
okay. Hung Sure is gone to Taiwan. I think they'll be back
28th.
next weekend.
28th, I think.
What is the
Tuesday.
28th? Is that a? Yeah, so probably 2 Saturdays in a row. We'll still have the Saturday night lecture, but
Yeah.
it won't be Hung Sure.
Yes, it will be Jin Fosher. This
Okay.
Saturday next.
Do they celebrate Thanksgiving in Taiwan?
No, they don't.
They don't?
We're not thankful.
Oh my gosh, you're not thankful for anything, okay. Oh, I see, you didn't come to Taiwan on 3 little ships and claim it in the name of some queen or king? Maybe that's why it'll outlast us. Anyhow, let's do the transference in English.
May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light break the darkness of their endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Sing Li San Bao.